a Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. Hi, and welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. And once again, I'm here with my good chum, Gary Bain. Hi, Gary.
Hello, Peter. How are you?
I'm very well. Looking forward to today's podcast. And what we're talking about today is the South Notts Hussars, their mobilisation, and the first period in England before they go to war in 1940. Now, so that's where we are at the moment. I'm looking forward to it. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I am, and I think it's a really good idea to do it in a different room at Hart Towers each week, and I'm really quite surprised that we're doing it from your recently installed sauna today, Peter.
It does bring a new perspective to the whole thing. I tried to recreate that desert condition, then I realised we're talking about Yorkshire in the middle of winter, but never mind.
Is that why we're wrapped up in towels?
Yes.
So
your towel is a bit small, by the way. That's more like a flannel. Not quite covering the subject over there, Gary.
Speak for yourself. So, Peter, South Notts Hussars, just a recap for me. Who are they and why are we talking about them? Well, the South Notts Hussars are a volunteer territorial unit. They're to give them their full title, they're 107 Regiment, Royal Artillery, or Royal Horse Artillery, they would tell you very firmly. They were two batteries, 425 battery and 426 battery, and they were two troops in each, and they had 18-pounder guns, which, for those of you, 3.3-inch caliber. They were territorial, so they used to be called Saturday night soldiers. They used to turn up at drill nights, which seemed to be any other night but Saturday, normally midweek, Tuesday into Thursday, and they do a bit of basic training, doing a bit of gunnery training, and then they go to weekend training where they'd practice a basic gun drill, you know how to drop the gun into action, how to load it, and not fire it. And then they went to a summer camp, which was a firing camp at Redesdale in the summer of 1939. And that's where we got to, basically, before the outbreak of war, which it happens in stages, because we always think it started on the 3rd of September 1939. Well, there's many dates the Second World War started, but the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September is when it all really kicks off for us, in the sense of mobilisation and everything else. So as a territorial unit, what sort of date did they start getting called together and giving up their civilian occupations? Well,
the key men are called in early, because there's a lot of trouble in Europe, and so back end of August they start calling them in, and then I think we're not quite sure of the exact date. Call up is the 1st of September, so it's the same date as the thing, and that's when they called up. And it must have been a strange situation for it, because you join the TA, Territorial Army. You're not really expecting to go to war necessarily. You've joined it partly duty. We talked about this in the last podcast on the South Notts Hussars. They've joined for a variety of reasons. Why have they joined? Many of them joined to try and avoid being in the infantry should there be a war.
So how did people feel about this now impending war?
Well, this is interesting because there are as many responses to war as there are. People always think there's one reaction to something. People were all dying to get at the Hun, or people were all delighted there was a war, or people were all in misery and fear. That's not the way human nature is. Different people react in different ways, and so what you do is try and get a balance. But just to give a couple of quotes, perhaps, if I can, to give an idea. One chap he's a miserable Scotsman. Well,
any other type?
Sorry, Second Lieutenant William Pringle, who 425 battery, and he said this. I can't do accents, so I'm not going to. everybody was so sick of, we're going to have a war. No, we're not. Yes, we are. No, we're not. The strain was getting too much for the people of this country. Thank God it's come. Now we can get on with the job and get it cleared up. We wanted rid of Hitler. So there's, so one reaction, just a bit like Brexit recently. Get it done. Not perhaps my views, but that was clearly a popular view. When there's something terrible lying ahead of you, you want to sort of almost get it over with, get it sorted one way or the other. And that's, But how frightened were they? Well, here's another chap I'd like to quote. This is Gunner Harry Day, another 425 batteryman. He said, we all had an element of fear. Everybody does. If you're going into war, you've a great chance of getting killed or wounded, as have millions more. I was young. I loved cricket, football, rowing. I would sooner have got killed than have my legs shot off, so I couldn't pursue my sporting activities. And that, two different attitudes, two different people. Some people must have been really worried, but for others, it's just a chance. Do you know, it's just a chance to get out of a boring job. How did you feel about your work at times in your long and distinguished working career? Not always enjoyed it. Do you know what I mean? And the chance to get away with your mates. Perhaps not really a war. Perhaps you won't even be mobile. Do you know what I mean? It's something that people sort of look to.
In the First War, there was this view that there was a rush to engage with the Hun because it was all going to be over by Christmas. Was there a similar view about the Second War, or was there more a sort of reluctant acceptance of their fate?
I think it's much more the second, Gary. They weren't that keen. I think most people are just doing there what I was saying. People shouldn't. Everybody, no, not everybody, but a lot of people had realised from the experience of the First World War, the Great War, that this was going to take years, not months, not weeks. No over by Christmas, no bloody nothing. In fact, I've got a lovely little quote which not only shows that, but shows the insensitivity of youth. And as a parent myself, I'm well aware that children are insensitive brutes. And this one, particularly dedicate this to my daughters Lily and Ruby, who definitely will not be listening, as they show no interest in military history at all. And this is what a chap called Gunner Dennis Middleton, who was a bit of a joker and clearly an insensitive bastard, to use the vernacular. Here he goes. I remember saying goodbye to my mother and saying, "Nah, don't expect me back. We shall be away a long time, at least 2 years." And she burst into tears. I was merely trying not to raise false hopes on her behalf. But you can just picture that poor mother. Actually, it was 4.5 years. But, the point was, it's just... oh, dear, youth.
We touched briefly in the first podcast on the expectation that the aircraft, the bombers, were going to get through. And there was a social aspect to that. You mentioned people were worrying about, should they get married, should they not get married? Against a backdrop of a military unit mobilising, how were they feeling about their families being left behind?
Well, they were incredibly worried about them, because there was this idea that the bomber would always get through. So you're called up, 1st of September, you're called up, off you go to war. You'd be leaving your lovely Janet behind, the woman that shares your trials and tribulations. Well, I suppose most of the trials and tribulations are hers when you think about it. But, you're leaving your family, you're leaving your kids. I know you'd be delighted to leave your kids behind. But it's all a bit much. It's a serious moment in time. Very serious. And the call-up is an entertaining thing because they're all sort of being called in, and they're all going in, and some of them are a bit nervous, and other, here's a quote from Bill Adams, and he said this is someone who was bored at work. Bill Adams, 426 battery, and he said, I was on nights at work, and I got the telegram, and I thought, well, that's a relief. It was a job I was doing to earn money, but I didn't like it. To think we'd be having a break from routine work, night and day and afternoons. I thought, now we're going to be out in the fresh air and breathe some clean air for a change. Well, off he went to the desert eventually, but not so clean and lovely there, dust everywhere. But, that's one thing. And one of my favourite stories, which isn't a quote, but there was a chap called Sykes, lovely chap. I interviewed him, Jack Sykes, and his father was the Sergeant Major, Harry Sykes. He was a bus driver, and when he was something off on the buses, which our Australian friends won't understand at all, but we do as old people. There's a terrible sitcom called On the Buses, and what he did was he got the call up, and he had a full load of bus passengers, and he just drove to the Derby Road Drill Hall, and got out and left the bus and the passengers. And I just love that whole idea. So off they're going, and they're beginning to wonder, are they proper soldiers? And there's actually stories. Sergeant Major, does this mean we're proper soldiers? And you can imagine the answer. You were in the army, just exactly what that Sergeant Major would say. It's a good. So where did they go? Well, they went into the Derby Road Drill Hall, which where do you think that is?
Nottingham.
Yes, on Derby Road, you bastard. You didn't fall for that, did you? And the officers stayed close by in a lovely hotel, although just a hotel, really. Whereas and headquarters were at Derby Road. But then 425 Battery went to the Hollins Lace Factory and a pavilion of the tennis club. I think they were better off at a tennis club. And then 426 was put in 2 schools, Radford and Lenton. And this is where that thing you raised, air. And they're all going, because they're all there was an air raid alert on the day war broke out, the 3rd of September. And they're all going, and so what they did was they went up and tried to make a sandbag thing on the roof. And they had their Lewis gun. And now, those of you who know a Lewis gun, it doesn't fire many rounds, does it? It's about 39. I never remember how many rounds it is. Historians don't have to remember facts. They can just bluster madly at times. Well, certainly, I'm perhaps not academic to get the full bluster effect, but, that bit of blustering. 39 rounds. Anyway, and they were up there, and they were all thinking, they built up all this sandbagged area. And, of course, then they thought, wonder what supporting weight this roof's made for. The perfect story would be it fell in, but it didn't. But nor did the air raid come either, So and what they do then is they settle into a routine of training. Now, they don't stay in Nottingham long. You wouldn't expect them to, really, would you? They got a new colonel, because the old colonel wasn't released from his day job. All right for some. He was old. And they got a new chap who'll crop up in our tale called Lieutenant Colonel William Seeley, down to his friends as Bill, so we'll carry on calling him William Seeley, I think, for the most part. And he was promoted to command the 107 Regiment, the South Notts Hussars. They were there for 3 weeks. And here's a quote from Lance Sergeant Ian Sinclair. He was incredibly good looking, something that neither you nor I will ever know or experience, because we both have faces that are ideal for radio, I think you put it.
Hence the podcast.
Hence the podcast rather than some sort of video cast. We'd frighten the horses, I think. But this is a quote from, he was known as, when he commanded a troop, it was known as Glamour Troop. He was that good looking. And he said this about what they were doing, and you might remember this from when you were a soldier. Just learning to be soldiers living together, accepting that the discipline that was necessary to living in billets, being subject to discipline 24 hours a day. You were never that, for a start. Getting people on parade quicker, getting them better dressed, teaching blokes to march that couldn't, having to exercise authority on things that yesterday didn't matter when you were still a free man, being told you must or you will rather than will you. That was the thing, and some people didn't take kindly to it. I loved it. Well, how did you take to discipline, Gary?
Very well. So not only would they be doing drill and learning the basics of military training, but they'd also be presumably doing physical training.
Yes, well done. I'd forgotten that. Yes, of course. Yeah, PT. And one of the people I interviewed who was most impressive was a chap called Ray Ellis. Now, Ray Ellis, when I knew him, was a school teacher. He was about 70 when I interviewed him. I actually went to the pub with him. He was that much of a good chap. I don't normally go to the pub with people I interview, but he was a great guy. And he gave an idea of how sometimes officers don't understand. It's not one rule for them and one rule for the others. And this is one thing I always admired about Montgomery, who stamped on this sort of thing. I'm going to read a quote to you from now. So this is Ray Ellis, and he said this. They went for a route march in Woollerton Park. And Ray said, "We set off with our full kit and boots. At this period, we're not accustomed to wearing army boots, and we were used to wearing shoes, and it's a big change. You've got to get your feet acclimatised. We had an officer marching smartly in front, but he wasn't wearing boots. He was wearing a Sam Brown belt and a pair of light brogues, and that was it. We'd marched quite a long distance when we passed a parked car in which sat another officer, and these two changed places, so that now we had a fresh young officer wearing shoes. We got back with our feet all bleeding and sore, and they told us, 'You have to be toughened up. You never know what might lie in store for you.' We thought, isn't it going to lie in store for you as well? Surely you ought to be doing it. It rankled." And I think that's a cracking quote that gives you the idea of what later on in the war Montgomery was trying to stamp out. Officers have to be as fit as the men, right up to colonel level and beyond. If you're not fit, you're not fit for action, and because you will face the same things as the men face. So that was jolly interesting. The other thing is route marches. If you do oral history, and I ought to mention at the start, this is all based on an oral history project I did for the Imperial War Museum, and we hope you can listen to this stuff on the Imperial War Museum website. I've made arrangements that it will go up eventually. But as I've left and now retired, I think they might ignore me for a bit. Anyway, this is a quote from...
They actually ignored you while you were there, Peter.
Yes. This is a quote from Gunner Ted Whittaker, who's a great chap. I loved interviewing him. And this is just the classic route march story. One of our great characters was Max Miller, nicknames, army nicknames. He used to march at the head of route marches and lead the singing. One of his favourites was a music hall turn called Sid Seymour and his Mad Hatters, who had this weird thing. When they came on stage, he'd shout, "Are you ready, girls?" And they'd shout in a very falsetto voice, "The girls are ready." I can't do falsetto, but never mind. Every now and then on a route march, Max would shout at the top of his voice, "Are you ready, girls?" And 425 battery would all reply, "The girls are ready." Then they'd break into "Roll out the barrel." Great. I mean, just great stuff. This is why oral history's fun. You don't get the feeling in just in a printed page that you do when you can hear their voices and hear the humour and almost, the accents, because these guys speak in Nottinghamshire accents, not Chesterfield accents. So
where are they now? So they move from Derby Road. They move out
Well, they
of
move
Nottingham?
into their billets, the factories and the schools, and then what happens then is that they start to get in some of the. Well, what happens is that the whole basis changes. They stop being TA because the National Service Armed Forces Act, I'm having to look this up obviously because I can't remember anything, which imposed conscription on all men between 18 and 41 years old, unless ineligible through bad health, reserved occupation or accepted conscientious objection. And this meant that territorials didn't have to volunteer for overseas service. They were part of the army. There's only one army from that point onwards, and that's quite an interesting point. They left on the 23rd of September 1939, and I interviewed a real joker called Bill Hutton. Now, Bill Hutton was a wealthy farmer, but he always seemed to have the attitude of a ne'er-do-well about town. He was almost blind, and he gives a fine apocryphal story, which it's quite long, but I think you'll enjoy it because, again, it shows that officers have not quite grasped what needs to. At this stage, I need to make it clear, the officers later on were fantastic, but at this stage, they, like the men, are learning what it means to be in the army proper. And this is they were leaving from Victoria Station, which is now a big shopping centre. So no, you won't find it there now. And then on 23rd of September they leave. And this is Bill's story. He says, "We had the band and we marched down from the drill hall down Derby Road. A very fine show it was. I don't know how smart we were. I should think half of us were out of step." We marched to Victoria Station, we all lined up. Lots of people had come to see us off. My parents had come. They were all on the platform. The train came into the station and everyone got on. We put all our kit on the luggage racks and we sat down, packed tight like sardines. Then we all had to get off the train. Why? Because the officers hadn't got enough room. They wanted 2 compartments. We all got on the train again and moved down a bit, so we're even more squashed together. We all got nicely settled. Get off the train! We all got off the train again. And then they moved us up again. I think the officers wanted another compartment. My father said, Good God, I hope the Germans are in just as big a mess as we are.
And where were they off to, Peter?
They were off to Rillington, which is in Yorkshire. So this is terrible news for anybody. I mean, anybody visiting Yorkshire will know that this is plumbing the depths of what's about in England. A ghastly place, all of it without exception. The various places I've ever lived are Durham. They hate Yorkshire. I've lived in Lancashire or Liverpool. They hate Yorkshire and Derbyshire. And funnily enough, Derbyshire people hate Yorkshire people most of all. Anyway, that's an aside, I suspect, which might get me a lot of letters from Yorkshire. Anyway, they were now joining the 5th Cavalry Brigade, which is part of the 1st Cavalry Division. And they, as Royal Horse Artillery, are the artillery for that division, or for that brigade. They're the ones who support the cavalry. And at this stage, they are still cavalry. Now, they're in billets. Now, the billets are awful. I mean, they haven't really thought ahead. And this is a quote from Gunner Fred Langford, who's 425 Battery. And I like this. We arrived in the very early hours of the morning, and they just cleared the pigs out of the pigsty. We had to clean the pigsties up. Personally, I was a little bit lucky as I was in a loft with hay. Quite a lot was sleeping where the pigs had been sleeping. I'd been used to an early morning wash and shave in a nice warm bathroom, instead of which I was out in the open. A row of taps had been plumbed in, washing and shaving with a cold northeastern Yorkshire wind blowing. Right through his what's-its, I expect. It's rough old stuff, you know. And the thing is, you used to smoke, I think. Yes, yeah. You did. Well, what would you have done in the hayloft?
I'd have had a fag.
And I can picture you now lying back, just slightly falling to sleep. Not a care in the world, Gary, eh? Not a care in the world. Anyway, the other thing...
Where were the officers billeted? Were they in the same place?
No, they were in pubs and nice houses, yeah. It's not entirely... I mean, that's just how it is. There's no point in getting cross about that kind of stuff, really. But perhaps one thing that we could get across, the men got very cross about, was the food. And at Rillington, it was beyond belief. It was, and this is a quote from, I'll have to look it up, a gunner Bob Faulds. Now, Bob Faulds' family were very helpful to me in preparing the book that I've just written on this unit. And so I'm particularly fond of Bob Faulds. He was a lovely man. When I interviewed him, he looked about 50. He was about 65 to 70. He was one of those people who never got old. He was amazing. A lovely man.
A bit like me.
A bit like you, only slightly... thinner. Now, here we go. This is what Bob Ford said. The food was really outrageous. It was terrible. It used to come up to us on open lorries. The weather was getting distinctly cold. They used to give us the most inappropriate things. Fried bacon and egg. It would come to us in big trays, absolutely congealed to the tray. The tea used to come in hay boxes, box stuffed with hay. That's a bit of a surprise there. And a container of tea inside. Of course, that was stone cold with a skim on top. It was most unappetising, and sometimes it was quite uneatable, the food, even though we were terribly hungry and very young. I think you kept going on large slices of bread and jam. And then, this is the officer's quote. Now, I told you, this is a very good officer later on. This is Second Lieutenant William Pringle. Second Lieutenant gives you the clue. He is an officer under training. That's what second lieutenants are. You know, they're bloody useless. And this guy, self-knowledge, he knew. He didn't know then, but he knew thinking back. And he said this. He's talking about the food. It was bloody awful. But if someone told you to go and improve that food, what would you do? How would you start? You wouldn't know where to start, would you? You don't know whether it's bad meat to start with, whether it's rotten or tough. You don't know how to alter any of it. And that just sums it up. You don't know. You've not got the experience. You don't know. You've got the wrong men in charge of the cook. No, cooks are often the dirtiest and most insanitary members. Were you a cook, by the way? I just suddenly thought of that.
No. You are really getting across your message to just about everybody, really.
Yeah, I'm going for people today. Anyway, so the officer's lack of experience meant that the food wasn't very good. The billets...
So, as you know, limited military career, but I would have expected the colonel to get involved and sort that out.
Only appointed a month ago, quite inexperienced. He'd been a battery commander. Yeah, perhaps lack of grip, lack of grip at every end. You know, possibly other things on his mind. Lack of experience, but they did. So they're in bad billets, badly selected. They've got terrible food. They haven't got clean blankets, which is absolutely deadly. Dirty, inadequate washing facilities. Impetigo breaks out, because we don't get much impetigo now, but I've had it once. I caught it off the dog, and that's another story. But sorry, we're just a bit of laughing now at the very thought of that. But I had it on my face. Impetigo's nasty stuff, and it's quite difficult to get rid of. I think you paint yourself with purple unction, although that may be something else. Anyway, so it took a long while for things to get right. Meanwhile, they're doing gun drill. They've got no vehicles, really, so they're just doing gun drills. Dragging the guns about, using drag ropes, doing endless gun drill. We talked about the gun drill last time. If you want to listen to that, we'll talk about that. You know, change round. So you act as gun sergeant, you act as layer, you act as loader, you act as, change round, learning to do every job. Gun drill. And while they were at it, but they weren't there long, because 4 or 5 weeks, 6th of November, they move, and this time they go to Rugby in Lincolnshire. Now, obviously, being Lincolnshire, it's a lot nicer than Yorkshire, their billets here are better. Now, why is that? Perhaps they're just getting more experience. And they get issued with new guns. This, I know, made...
Excellent.
Yeah, you think, fabulous, hurrah, new guns, because their old guns, the Mark IV 18-pounders, were taken away from them to be converted to be 18 25-pounders, a sort of conversion. 25-pounders are just makeshift. And what did they get, Gary? What do you think they got? The latest mark of gun?
Latest technology, all singing, all dancing, I would have thought.
Well, this is the quote from Sergeant John Whitehorn. It was quite a stiff sergeant, and really nice bloke, but a sergeant. He said this: in their place, we got a full complement of Mark IIs, which had 1917 marked on the breeches. The breeches were clumsier. They had a pole trail, so you got very little elevation. Once you dug in, you couldn't move it sideways. There were still steel tyres on wooden wheels. The limbers had pneumatic tyres. Oh, that's something then, yeah. They had wooden bungs in the muzzles, and for drill purposes only, marked clearly in white paint on the trails. They were useless. We couldn't fire them. And that's what they carried on training with, so it's still no firing.
So no live firing at all?
No live firing at all. The live firing was only at Redesdale in the summer, before the war had started. Excellent. So and what else is happening while they're at... The other thing that's happening is something that would, I suspect, have happened to you and I. They were weeding out the undesirables. Now... What is an undesirable as far as South Notts Hussars are concerned? Well, some of the men had passed the medicals who clearly weren't fit. Then, we can't imagine it now, although I'm sure our lovable government will soon have it. Tuberculosis was quite common. Those diseases from the 19th century, which, but there were still some of them hanging around. People were just not fit. Some people were just chronically fit. Some were too old. They've been in the TA for a fair while, and they were really too old to go on active service. Some were too young to go on active service. 18-year-olds, and they're weeding them out, and they're either sent back to civilian life or they're sent back to 150 Regiment. That's the other 150 Regiment Royal Artillery, which is the other part of the South Notts Hussars, which, as I say, we're not dealing with at all. Now. These men are all leaving. They've got to be topped up. Now, where can it be topped up from?
Well, presumably you could get local militia to increase the numbers.
So what's happening is the conscripts, because they had brought in a measure of conscript for people. That's one reason that people joined the TA, was to avoid being conscripted into the militia. But they did have a lot of militia. Now, they were conscripts, and some of the South Notts Hussars initially looked down on them. And it's the classic thing, volunteer, conscript. Volunteer, conscript. You can call them militiamen all you like. They're conscripts. But on the other hand, some of the militiamen looked down on the TA because actually they'd had 6 months training, whereas the TA had once a week training and weekend camps and one summer camp. So in actual fact, some of the militiamen were actually better trained than the so-called South Notts Hussars, the TA members. So this is an interesting thing. I loved interviewing one chap called Ted Holmes, who was from Chesterfield, which is one of the many places I claim as a hometown. He, when I interviewed him, he was this is a bit of a sidelight, but he was the man who he was a grave digger at Haslam Church, and I did at least an hour on grave digging because it was absolutely fascinating. But perhaps for another time. He said this about them when he joined them. He was a militiaman, and when he was sent to the South Notts Hussars, he found it quite weird. They were like Fred Carno's army. The officers had riding boots and breeches, like horsemen. Some of them talked a little bit posh. He really was. Chesterfield accent, Hutton, that kind of thing. I liked the Royal Artillery badge with a gun on it. I thought, an artillery regiment with an acorn badge? That seems funny. It seems odd, because the South Notts were allowed to wear their yeomanry acorn badge. It was an acorn leaf and one of them things called acorns. That's it. Yeah. So... So these people came in. Another prominent one that came in was a chap called Tommy Foley. He'd been a professional boxer. He was from Chesterfield as well. I love Chesterfield. And he'd been a middleweight champion or something. I'm not quite sure. I looked him up and he didn't appear to be that high up, funnily enough. But he used to take 4 or 5 of them on. So get 6 of them. A sparring partner, he'd sort of spar with one. Finish him, he'd be knackered. He'd get another one. And he was just, You used to do a bit of boxing, didn't you?
Yes.
What weight did you box at, Gary?
I was a lightweight. In fact, I think I was a flyweight when I started.
So which part of your body did you...
It's just my leg now, yes. I think. So in the recruitment of the militiamen then, you've mentioned 2 from Chesterfield there. In the Great War, of course, they tried PALS battalions and tried to keep people from local towns together. Were the militia recruited from around the Nottingham area, if possible?
They did. They made an effort, and I think that was quite good because in one way, because it meant that people slotted in better. On the other hand, exactly right. Great point. The PALS business. We'd had all that on the first day of the Somme, where whole communities had sort of 300 or 400 men killed on a single day. And you are at risk, because if the unit ever gets completely smashed, then a lot of people from the same area will suffer. They had spread it a bit. It's not as tight as the PALS battalions were. So remember, Chesterfield it's 20 miles from Nottingham, and Nottingham's a big place, and they recruited a lot from roundabouts Nottingham. But you're right, it is still this localised effect, and let's hope the South Notts Hussars are never wiped out in action, which is a little bit of a clue as to what's going to happen to them. Well, not wiped out, but certainly suffer. Now, there was another class of people who come, and these are reservists. Now, reservists, I ought to explain, they're regular soldiers who've finished their time in the army, and they've been sent off to civilian life. And they come to the army. Now, one problem with reservists, there's 2 problems with reservists. One is, now, you left the army a few years ago. Have you maintained the superb physical condition that you'd expect of a regular soldier?
Yes.
This pregnant pause, ladies and gentlemen, is to reflect on what Gary just said. And I hope one day you see a photograph of Gary looking as he does now in this sauna. No, the thing is, people put on weight. They lose their physical fitness, they lose their toning, they can't lift their own body weight. I never could lift my own body weight. You certainly, well, you'd have to be some sort of weightlifter to lift your body weight. It's just... You're looking slightly cross. Anyway, you didn't see any of this coming, did you? So, they're not... So the one thing is, some of them aren't really young enough and fit enough. The other thing is this, and this is Bill Hutton. And he noticed something about these old regulars coming in. When I say old, they're in their 30s. But that's old if you're 18 or 19 or 20, And this is Bill Hutton said this. A lot of them were old sweats and old rogues. They'd really come as horse holders for the officers and to give us a bit of age, because we were all very young. They got all the cushy jobs. I think they were better at skiving than as soldiers. We didn't know how to skive when we got into the army, did we? But we soon learned. He certainly did. He got a lovely job as a Donard, did Bill Hutton, a motorcycle dispatch rider. And that's the thing. There's a lot of... They're good, but some of them were great and became sergeants. They did brilliantly and nothing but admiration. Others were absolutely reprehensible scoundrels. And they're the ones that are most fun because their names crop up in the history, and wherever they crop up, there's something being stolen, something being broken, somebody's doing something disrespectful to authority, and those. I'm not going to mention the names because their families might one day listen, but it's great fun. Somebody else arrives at this time though, and do you know what? I remember interviewing him. I thought, bloody hell, that's strange. And this guy was called Ted Hayward. Ted Hayward was a top chef in the hotels of London and other places. He was a pastry chef. He did it all, those fancy things, those cakes that you love to eat so much, with the cream and he did all that. Anyway, he said this, it came over the radio that the South Notts Hussars were looking for a sergeant cook. It was then I volunteered. I knew I'd be going sometime later. And I thought, well, it's just as well to know where you're going, rather than trust the lap of the gods, which didn't always turn out to your advantage. And cooking was my line. So he joined as a cook. And of course, when he got in, once he'd signed the papers, guess what happened?
Infantry?
No. No, you're too cynical. No, the word that's missing is sergeant. Because he goes in, oh yeah, you'll be a sergeant. He gets in, he's not a sergeant, he's a private. And for a while, and he said this, the cooking was shocking. A long form was put out. There was a big dixie of stew, which it was hard to decipher what it really was. There was stewed apricots and custard. You had a plate and they seemed to use the same spoon for dishing out the stew as they did the apricots and custard. The taste of it was quite abysmal. And he goes on to talk about, once he starts cooking, he starts to realise the problems that the cooks... Now, the cooks are a bunch of not very trained individuals, and they're not... Yeah, I could see him staring in astonishment. And he goes on, frozen meat was issued to us for consumption the same day. We would hack it up to bits and hope for the best. It would be pretty hard and inedible. Nobody gave any thought to linking the main element of the meat with any kind of vegetables issued. For instance, I've seen frozen rabbits issued, and the only veg were raw beetroots. I'm just laughing. Now, I don't mind who the chef is. I defy any chef to produce a meal from frozen rabbits and raw beetroot, and one can only endorse his words. Now, we might hear from him again. He also referred to the fact that, tinned pilchards. Everybody knows tinned pilchards are good for you. You know that, Gary. You know that you need to be eating more tinned pilchards. But the fact is, if you were given a tin of pilchards for your lunch today, would you eat it? Would you, buggery? You don't eat tinned pilchards. You say you're going to eat. So they had mounds of it. They used to build walls out of it later on in the war. And that's the problem. The wrong things are issued. One thing that's interesting, I'll just mention it now in case I forget later. He stayed in the army and rose to be a brigadier in charge of the Army Catering Corps. That's weird that someone should join as a cook, literally a private, because he did, and end up as a brigadier in charge of the Army Catering Corps. Great man, Ted Hayward. Anyway, people are all getting to know each other. The training's building up. They're getting used to life. And here's a quote from Gunner Harold Harper, one of my favourites, a tough soldier who became tough, but at the start wasn't. But he said this: war was a serious business, and gone were the days of the TA when you looked upon it as escapism from your normal work. By the time the war had been on about 6 to 8 weeks, we were well and truly war-orientated. Gradually, the cliques were merging together. It was very noticeable. We were aware we were using swear words. We all had to be in the same swim. There was a war on, and that sort of gave you permission. So they're all effing and blinded by now. Like just as in, when they were at the camp, Harold Harper had been shocked by that. Now he's effing and blinding with the rest of them. Now, it becomes apparent they're off to Palestine to join with the 1st Cavalry Division to replace the regular units of the regular army who were garrisoning Palestine. And they're going to go in January 1940. Now here there's a decision to be made. If you've got a lovely girlfriend, what's that decision you have to make?
Are you going to get married?
Yeah. You know, because you're going to go away. What are you going to do about it? You know, are you going to get engaged and not get married? Are you going to get married quickly? So, you know, but if you get married quickly, what's going to happen? What's going to happen if you're killed? You know, then she's been married once. And in those days, people... I mean, you've been married a couple of times, I believe, you know. Or is it 3 times? No, 2 times. Yeah. And this is what Bombardier Charles Ward said. I got engaged that Christmas. I decided not to get married because I didn't think it was fair. I was just going abroad. I didn't know then I should be abroad for 5.5 years, I can assure you. But I thought it might be a long time. We were very much in love, and I thought it was a bond. And that's the other thing. Unspoken is you get engaged and stop them. Well, what could it be stopping them doing? Or you hope it's stopping them doing dilly-dallying with other servicemen or whatever, you know. And people want to be secure in their relationships before they go off. Anyway, so before they go, they have one last service. And this is part of the traditions of these of the services. They've got an honorary colonel, and his name is Lancelot Rolleston. Honorary Colonel Lancelot Rolleston. He was a Boer War veteran. I think he'd been wounded in the Boer War. Yeah, he's that old. He's 90-odd. I can see your face there. You're worried I'd made a mistake. He was over 90, and he wanted to say farewell to his regiment. And Ray Ellis, remember I said, the ex-school teacher said, headmaster, it was a bitterly cold day, one of those frosty mornings with a fog, a really biting day. After the church parade, we stood on the school playground, and old Rolleston, with no greatcoat, he stood and addressed us. A great old man, and that is where we first heard the words, once a hussar, always a hussar. Now, less dramatic than that, also a quote from Ray, was on the 19th of January, they marched down to the Rugby railway station to catch a train, surprisingly enough, and he says this: we were marching along this icy road, and it was difficult to keep your feet with all your equipment, rifles, ammunition, field kit bags. We were sliding about trying to march. Somewhere near the church I heard a woman say, God help them, they don't know what they're going to. No, we didn't. And that will be the story we carry on telling in the other once a month. These podcasts are weekly, but one a month is going to be on the South Notts Hussars. I hope you're enjoying hearing about them, because it's just ordinary soldiers going to war. This is what the war is like for everybody, you know.
Yeah, and I can't wait now to hear the next instalment, as it were, now that they're off to pastures new. And one of the things that I'm finding interesting is it's well known the impact of the railways, for example, on the Great War, but it seems that the railways are also determining what's happening with the Second War, which, you know, surprising. I wonder, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about what would have happened had we not had that means of moving mass troops and mass equipment around, and what sort of war it might have been.
Great point. It would have been impossible, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Peter. Perhaps you put some more coal on the sauna, and
we can relax.
And we can relax. I look forward to the next one.
Cheers, Gary.
Cheers, Peter.